Hey guys, welcome back. This will be a recap of week 14. Lost track of time there for a second. So, with week 14, we had a test that I see come up quite a bit. And let me know if you guys are hearing me and everything's okay. But a test that I see come up a bit on the forums. Looks like I pushed the wrong button. You guys should be able to hear me now. Is that better? Yeah. That's what I get when I'm pushing too many buttons at once. Um, so, week 14 was a fuel rail pressure sensor test. Connected the pressure transducer or the pulse sensor, first look sensor, Nicholson pulse sensor, Cody pulse sensor, whatever you want to call it. We had that connected to the vacuum port on the fuel pressure regulator. Now, this is a test that I see come up quite a bit in questions in different Facebook groups, automotive forums. Um, People are wondering, how can we test the relative flow of the injectors while the engine is running? Maybe we have a restricted injector. Maybe we can't access the injectors. The vehicle doesn't have a fuel test port. We can't do an injector balance test that way. So can we do it another way? And on the Forerunner I was working on, the results were kind of iffy, and you guys saw that in the video. I didn't find them ultra conclusive. Um, they leave a lot of gray area. So I advise you guys to try this test out, and if it's not making sense, then you may just have to throw this test out the window and move on to a different method of testing. So I want to thank everyone from joining in today. Chris Daniels in the chat. I saw on Facebook today that he passed his L1 ASE test. Congratulations. And thank you everyone else for participating. We are going to jump into the waveforms that you guys submitted. I found that some of the waveforms that you guys submitted, you had the same results I did, which were inconclusive, and others had actually very good waveforms that showed a lot of detail and showed the different injector. Every time the injector fired, there was a drop in the apparently a drop in the rail pressure. We're just watching the diaphragm that is in the fuel pressure regulator. So if it's a V6 engine, V8 engine, and that regulator's on one side, we may not be picking up all the information that's on the other side of the fuel rail, or it may be delayed, or it may have a lower amplitude. So I'm going to jump in here and we're going to check out some of the posts that you guys have put up. Well, at least you showed up, Corey. I don't know how long we'll keep you here, but at least you're here for a minute. Okay, Bob Newman has a 99 Chevy Cavalier. This is his typical test vehicle, which is good because it shows good results on pretty much every test that we've done so far. Yellow is, I'll blow this up in a second. Yellow is going to be his pulse sensor, and red is the injector number 1 sync. First waveform is the pulse sensor connected to the regulator. Second waveform is a mechanic stethoscope on number 1 injector only. Third waveform being a peak and hold injector. There's a double spike when using this stethoscope. So let's open this up. So fuel injector number 1 with pulse sensor connected to the regulator. We can see a slight drop. Now, Bob, I think I saw you in the chat already. Are you using the ATS pulse sensor, or is this like the vacuum transducer that they have? I know they have one that's a little more sensitive than others, but we can see some slight oscillations here, and we see a dip every time one of the fuel injectors fires. Now we see the double pulse here because it's a peak and hold injector. But we can at least see a little bit of information. We can see that slight dip every time one of the injectors was firing. So in this case, if we had a injector that you hooked up the lab scope and you saw a pintle hump movement, but you still seem like you have a lean misfire and you didn't see a drop in this right here, and you had one that was a odd man out, then it's possible that that injector has a plugged up screen. The nozzle tip is carboned up, something like that, that's causing a lack of fuel flow, even though the injector pintle is moving. And Bob said no, he's using the Cody Auto Diag pulse sensor. So this one here, mechanic stethoscope plugged into the pulse sensor. So we are using the piezo transducer and the pulse sensor to use it like a microphone, and that stethoscope's going to amplify all the noises from the rail. He has it sitting on the fuel rail for the number 1 injector. Now we are going to get a little pulse because it's going to echo through that rail from the other injectors, so we can see those other injectors firing here. And then, oh sorry, that's the electric portion, and then here is the yellow is the pulse sensor. So we actually don't see it firing. But Bob, I'm wondering if you cranked up the resolution on this, if you had zoomed in, if we would see a little bit of noise coming from those other ones. From my experience, you see a little bit of noise from the other injectors, just like if you had the stethoscopes in your ear and you were listening at the fuel rail. Sometimes it's hard to tell, even on a vehicle that has a 4-cylinder engine where you're testing those injectors. You think you hear it clicking, but it could be coming from one of the other injectors. But we can see some slight variations or fluctuations in this in the middle here, but we do see some spikes as that pintle moves. So this test wouldn't confirm the fuel flow, but it would confirm that our injector is firing. And then here's a zoom in on the voltage waveform for that injector. We have our first inductive kick, because they pull the voltage down here to open the injector. They release part of it and then they hold it, not quite down to ground, and then they release it. So the injector is probably, if we had the current ramp, the injector is probably open from this area over here to this area when it closes. And I did not realize that Cavalier was still using a peak and hold injector in 99. I would have assumed that these were a high impedance injector. So most peak and hold injectors are a low impedance, or they're around like 3 to 4 ohms, and the high impedance injectors, which are just a normal, they're not a peak and hold, they just open up and close, are around 12 to 14 ohms. And back to the beginning. Thank you for that one, Bob. I may have said Paul a minute ago. I meant Bob on this one. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the zoom in process on the ATS scope. Angel Garcia turned one in. 2001 Chevy Tahoe with a 4.8 known good idle capture, and then he got a capture with an injector unplugged. So here we can see a waveform, the pulse sensor. Now we see it's kind of an irregular waveform, but we do have some consistencies, and he went ahead and put some rulers on here. And I'm not sure if those are, I can count them here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He has them lined up on the injector pulses. So right after this one, we see a slight dip, and then it starts to rise. After this one, we see a slight dip, it starts to rise. This one, we see at least a little bit of noise around it, a slight change in pressure. This one, not so much. This one, I would look at it and I would say that this test data is inconclusive. It wouldn't lead me to believe, but we could be seeing that some of these are delayed if they're on the other bank of the engine. We may not get that dip in pressure all the way across the rail until a few milliseconds later. So this is what I was talking about. Sometimes you see a really nice, clean, clear picture, and I think the 4-cylinder engines are going to give us a better picture than what we're going to see on the V8. That's without the markers. And then let's see. I think this one, was this the one with it unplugged? No, that's a known good. So here's the one with an injector unplugged. So injector number 3 is unplugged, and the waveform doesn't look that much different than what we had before. Firing order, he has it listed here, 1872, 6543. So are we synced on number 1? Idle, injector number 3. I'm betting we're synced on number 1. So the injector right before it is the one that's unplugged. Let's see if we see a difference there. And we do see a slight difference. We jumped at this. No, that's the same one. Still, I would have a hard time picking that up to see the big difference of one injector that wasn't flowing fuel. So I'm going to say on the LS engines, it may not be my first choice to go with this method. Now, David shared one that showed up quite well. This was on a Toyota Tacoma with a 2.4, so an inline 4-cylinder. Does have a fuel pressure regulator, so he could connect to that one easily. And this one, we're seeing lots of oscillations in the rail. But we can see we have a trigger here, and we have 4 distinct injector firing events. So this one here, I would look at that one and I'd say, okay, I can trust that one. If we were missing one here in the middle, then I would know that we are not flowing fuel during one of the injector events. So I wonder if beyond a 4-cylinder engine, if this test becomes inconclusive. I can't remember if somebody tested this on an inline 6-cylinder Land Cruiser or not. Oh no, there's a V8 Land Cruiser in here. But on an inline 6, I wonder if that would show up better because it's one fuel rail. We don't have a branch tube going from one side of the engine to another. But I'm going to say 4-cylinder, the Cavalier and this Toyota Tacoma so far have shown up quite well. Injector number 2 is disconnected, so we can see that right here. We have a nice odd man out. We don't have an event right here. So I would say that this one turned out pretty good. Thanks for sharing that one, David. Oh, Jira, here's the one with the Land Cruiser, I believe. 2003 Toyota Land Cruiser. So this is the 4.7 liter V8. And this one I would say is the same type of deal that we ran into with the LS. When everything is connected, which I believe that's what this waveform is, it doesn't look like we have 4 firing events. Or 8 firing events. It looks like we have 4 firing events of the injectors. We have the injector current here. We can see the pintle hump of each one. We have the injector command for our sync on number 1. And we don't have a big change when number 1 injector fires. But we get some oscillations here when the next one, I believe this is 184366572, he put in the description. So we might only be getting the oscillations from one bank of that engine. And then here is with one injector unplugged. We do see a slight deviation here where these other ones we had more frequent oscillations and then we have a gap. It's at bank 2. So yeah, I think the 4 cylinders are going to be nice and clear for us. Let's see here. I lost my exit point. But I think the bigger engines are gonna leave us wondering. And I haven't watched that one yet. I'll have to check that one out. Doug Wilson has a couple of videos posted on here, but I'll watch that one as soon as we're done with the live stream here. Juan posted one. This is from a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure, was this week 12 or 13 that we did the fuel pump current? Might have been 11. I'm losing track of the weeks here. But 2013 Chevy Silverado 5.3. And why is it that Chevy and GMs are always the ones with the bad fuel pump. So this is the current for the fuel pump while beating on the tank. Once they hit the tank, they can get it running. We have some current, jumps up to around 10 amps, and then a flat spot where there's a bad spot in that pump, and then it jumps back up again, flat spot. And here is a capture afterwards with the new fuel pump. We're running a peak of around 7.2 or 7.3 amps and looks fairly regular. Richard Cook, 93 Acura Integra. So Jared said week 13. Yeah, I wonder if bank 2 would have showed up more dramatically, since that's the side that the regulator's on. And after we're done going through these, I do want to talk about some other methods that I was thinking about as the discussions kind of unfolded in the video comments on YouTube and in the group. So this one is a 4-cylinder, and we had a lot of weirdness in this picture that makes it to where it's kind of hard to identify a specific cylinder. So fuel rail pull sensor test. Now he doesn't say if this is synced up on injector number 1. We'll just open this up, zoom in on it. Yeah, I can't identify, what type of operation that is. That almost looks like ignition, but I'm not quite sure. It says fuel injector supply voltage, but it doesn't say what channel it is. So maybe this is running peak and hold injectors as well. But we have lots of inconsistency in the waveform, just like he noted. There's no definitive marker for our pulses, because it almost looks like here we have a rise in pressure as that injector fires. If this is another injector, we see a rise there. Here we have a rise. But on this one, we have a drop in pressure. So that one, I would say that no, we can't easily identify injector activity. I think that was a diesel injector with some uncertainty. Here has another one on that Land Cruiser, week 11 smart coil. So this is the typical Toyota ignition coil. We have this blue pulse is the IGT. This is our trigger or command going to that smart coil. The igniter or the power transistor is built into that ignition coil. We have current, and this is pretty typical of the Toyota or the Denso ignition coils. We have a nice slow ramp, and then once we get to a certain point, the ramp increases before it fires. And if you notice our this red line here, this is a feedback, and we get this little drop pulse here, and when this pulse comes back up to was that 5 volts? When the injector or when that coil stops pulling this down to ground is when this increase of amperage happens. So I don't know if that coil starts building up energy here, but it's kind of throttling it back a little bit. And then once it activates the trigger signal to the ECM, it says, okay, now let's go ahead and just fully charge because we're getting ready to fire. The computer releases the IGT, and then that ignition coil fires. And then we also have the secondary down here at the bottom, which is a little hard for you guys to see. That yellow doesn't show up real well. But we can see the energy building up in that secondary, and then it fires. We see our burn line and some oscillations at the end. He went ahead and measured. I've got to move my cup so I can see. And I need to move myself. I'm blocking the way. We can see the burn time here, and he has 2 cursors marked out here with some measurements up on the screen, and the delta is 1.669 milliseconds. So what we've seen from our previous live streams is we normally have 1.5 to 2.2 milliseconds of burn time, so it looks kind of right in the range. And then here's more of a parade of all the cylinders. We have the amperage from all of the ignition coils. We have the feedback. Oh, this feedback almost looks like it's separated per bank, which I guess I haven't done a whole lot of V8 Toyota ignition testing, because the V6 is all the feedback signals are tied together, but this one looks like it's bank specific. So at least if one of these gets shorted, maybe the engine can run on half a bank. Yeah, Paul, that's one of the methods I was going to talk about, and I couldn't remember who I watched do that on YouTube, because it's been a couple of years, and I think there were some posts about it in Auto Nerds as well. So thank you for getting caught up on this one, because you posted that this was week 11, I believe. Okay, we have a wiring diagram included here. So they have IGF-1, and more than likely they have an IGF-2 for the other bank. And Doug Wilson, week 14 question mark. Well, I did forget to post week 14 up in the Facebook group, even though I got the video up on YouTube. I also noticed as I was adding this one this morning that I forgot to post week 12, so I did add that unit as well. So he said, seemed to have a batch fire on startup. He has both the delta and the absolute sensor. The delta sensor is from Cody Gaddy, and the ATS exhaust probe for the absolute. Ran both on the exhaust probe setting. 95 Ford F-150. Shout out to Kevin here. We got another 5-liter Ford. Cylinder injector disabled during the testing, and sync on cylinder number 6 injector. So lots of information. Hopefully I can retain it as we look through the images. And Bart confirms that KY Home Garage did it. Valerie's telling me to look at my couch because my dog is sleeping on my couch and the cat is practically laying on the dog's feet. Now I lost track of which one was which. So we have a delta sensor and the absolute sensor. So I'm not sure which one is which here. I would almost say that the yellow must be the absolute, because we are steadily rising here, but then we do get a drop from time to time. And if that is a batch fire event on startup, then we are going to get a lot more fuel flow and a bigger drop all at one time during that event. And then it slowly recovers back to atmospheric. Now what's interesting is this is probably when the fuel pump primed. And if the rail pressure was lower, then when you prime the pump, it's going to fill up the rail pressure, and that diaphragm is probably going to, move one way or the other. But I'm not sure if that absolute sensor is inverted or not. I'm not sure if that ATS sensor is for vacuum or pressure on the absolute. And Doug says the delta sensor is the red, absolute is the yellow. So we're seeing really, really big pulses here on startup. And then this is the pulse with no miss. So we can still see the yellow here, and we see a distinct drop in pressure from time to time. Or is this our sync? This might be our sync. And then we have the pulse here. So on this one, even though it was a V8, we are seeing a much cleaner waveform than we are seeing on the Toyota and the LS V8. But maybe it's because this is an older vehicle that has a bigger fuel rail and bigger pressure regulator. I think that helps the waveform. If I remember right, these have the pressure regulator underneath the intake manifold, and they are probably about 1.5 inches in diameter, where the Toyota pressure regulators are only about 3/4 inch in diameter. So they have a much smaller diaphragm and spring inside of there. So that could be why we're getting a much more distinct picture here. No miss with the delta. So we can see, a drop in pressure, and then miss, So the delta sensor is pulsing a lot higher, but we're missing kind of a pulse over here. And then it also looks like we're missing something here, but then we have some weird oscillations in there as well. So at this point, we may not be able to use that information. And then we have the ATS exhaust sensor, which is an absolute sensor. Okay, so that first capture must have been our voltage on the injector, and not the exhaust sensor. And that's why we saw the drop in voltage and the rise, because of the cranking voltage of the engine. So I just completely butchered that first post. ATS exhaust sensor, and is this with an injector unplugged? Yep, injector number 5 disabled. So this one we can see more of a distinct pattern. So sometimes I guess the absolute sensor might be the better choice for some of these tests, which once I get it up tomorrow's video, I'm going to use both sensors in a test, and we're gonna compare which one gives us a better information. I won't reveal what the test is, but we're going to continue on with the pressure transducer and pulse sensor testing. Or get a longer hose. So this one we can see that one injector is affected. If we have a sync channel, we could identify that number 5 is not flowing fuel. And a picture of it. It's all blinged out. It's got a brush guard. We got some lights and a visor. And I can't tell if this is, yeah, that looks like a spotlight going through the A-pillar. And here is the 2 sensors that Doug was using. The pink breast cancer Cody Diag pulse sensor and the ATS tailpipe sensor. And now that I look at this waveform again, it's a little easier to identify that this is the injector control signal. So I should have realized that right from the start. The redneck ride. Yeah, that was probably a high dollar rig back in its day. It's still probably worth quite a bit. And I'd probably still prefer to own that than I would some of the newer Dodge trucks. Paul Smith has a 96 Toyota Tacoma 2.4. They were doing a starter on it, and it has a fuel pressure regulator. So perfect vehicle to get a capture on. So this is on startup. We have idle, raise the RPMs, 3 snap throttles, back to idle before shutting it off. Blue is the ignition sync. Red is the WPS teed in to the fuel pressure regulator, and green is the pulse sensor. Purple's a frequency math channel to simulate the RPM. So we have pulse sensor information here. We have WPS information here. Now, Paul, was this information, was this on a zoom setting? Because the WPS has several different settings. Or did you leave it in range 3 and just go down to 1 PSI? It's behaving like you're in one of the zoom modes. Yes, zoom 3. Okay. So if you guys haven't seen the WPS 500, it has 3 ranges. One is plus or minus 5 PSI. One goes up to, is it 100 PSI? And the other one goes up to 500 PSI, I think. I should know that since I use mine regularly. But then it also has 3 zoom settings, which make it behave a little more like a delta sensor, which is what we see here. It's mimicking his delta sensor with a little less noise, which sometimes is a good thing. Sometimes you want to see all the little noise and details, but we are seeing that mimicked here. And then, so we're on ignition coil for our sync, just a secondary pickup. So it'll be a little bit harder. I think this is a waste fire system as well, to identify which injector is which. But we can see that we have, distinct drops in pressure on each one of these, just like David had posted. Now we don't see the oscillations or ringing in that regulator, but we do see a distinct dip. So we could identify, that all of our injectors are firing and we do have fuel flow. Hey PJ, welcome. We're testing lots of Toyotas today. So you left Weber to come over here, and here is a zoomed out mode, or zoomed on the raised RPM. So we might be seeing a more distinct or more fuel being delivered, but it's happening more rapidly, so we may get a little bit of noise as well. And then this is a snap throttle and decel. So on deceleration, our PCM or ECM is not going to fire the injectors typically until it comes down, closer to idle, and then it'll start firing them again. So we can see that our RPM is a little slower here. Our pulses are further away, and right in here is probably our fastest point. And when we snap that throttle, a lot of those injector pulses, they may overlap each other, or they may be just starting to shut off fuel when another one starts flowing fuel. So we may see less pulses, or a little more noise with that waveform, and then we see a jump up because as we apply or stop firing those injectors, that fuel rail pressure is going to stabilize, and we may get some differences in the waveform. Now I believe PJ has done some testing on this as well. PJ, if you don't know what this week's assignment was, it was watching injector flow by using a pressure transducer or a pulse sensor on the regulator vacuum hose. I know you were working on that a while back. And then here's the first picture all zoomed out. I'm going to hold off on this one for now. This is a good capture, but this is going to apply to one of the weeks to come. So I won't completely go through it. If you guys have read it, that's fine. And if you want to read it, that's fine. I won't review it in this waveform. Remind me to come back to this one, Doug, whenever I put this weekly assignment up. And then I think that's it. We're back to, we covered this waveform from Scott Shellman last week. I'll refresh and make sure that nobody else has posted anything, and then we'll talk about some alternatives to this testing. Nope, that is it. So as you guys said in the chat, I couldn't remember who had done it. I watched the video a couple years ago. I guess it was KY Home Garage. What he did is he took a fuel pressure regulator and attached it to his fuel pressure gauge. So there wasn't actually fuel flowing through the regulator, I don't think. Or it was a low pressure regulator and the fuel was actually having to flow through the gauge. But he was just using the diaphragm attached to his fuel pressure tester, and then hooking the vacuum line of that regulator up to his pulse sensor. And that way he could measure the pulses in the rail without being affected by the fuel flow past the regulator. And I don't know, I can't remember what his results were, if they were any cleaner than what we were seeing. And like Ruben said, most of the vehicles don't have a regulator anymore. Most of them are returnless fuel system. So how can we test a returnless fuel system in this type of method? We could hook a pressure transducer up to the fuel rail, and we might be able to see it on our returnless system, because since the regulator's in the tank, it's going to try and maintain the fuel pressure in the rail, but it may take a second for that fuel pump to our regulator in the tank to realize that the pressure dropped a little bit as each injector fires. What I was wondering is if we can run, I know some of the fuel testers or fuel flow meters kind of go in line of the fuel rail. So you unhook the supply line, you hook up like the snap-on pressure gauge, you hook it up in line of that fuel rail, and then it has a shut-off valve so you can deadhead pumps and check the pressure that way. But what I was thinking is if we had a way of measuring the rail pressure, but then we put a restriction in line on the fuel that's flowing into it. So that way we could, if we were restricting it just slightly, every time an injector fires, we should get a drop in pressure. Okay, so KY Garage, his method was for returnless systems. So that makes sense. The vehicles with the return line, it's just kind of hard because they have so much fuel that's just flowing through that fuel rail that it's hard to get a good image. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the LS engine, I don't know if they circulate fuel through both rails. I think the fuel inlet and outlet are both on the driver's side rail, and that's where the regulator's at. So we're really, since it's not a series system, that other leg of the fuel rail is kind of like a parallel branch. We may not pick up those pulses very well. Bart says that his results looked really good. So that may be a method that we have to do. Otherwise, if this is inconclusive, we may have to go to just the regular injector drop testing where we put a pressure gauge or transducer on the rail, we prime the fuel pump, and we have to fire each injector. Now, more and more of the new vehicles are coming out with a relative injector flow test or an injector drop test built in to the scan tool. One second here. So like a Ford, you can go to a relative injector test. If it's a GDI vehicle, it'll crank the engine for so long to build up the rail pressure to a set point. It'll fire the injector so many times. It'll crank the engine again to build up the rail pressure, and it'll do the whole process for you. It'll give you the results at the end of the test. The vehicles that don't have the test is where we have to come up with another method. And typically it's installing a gauge on the rail, priming the fuel pump, shutting the fuel pump off, and using like an injector pulse tester like from OTC, plug it into that injector. It's going to fire that injector the same amount of milliseconds and the same number of pulses every time, and we're going to watch our pressure drop. Paul Smith said the Infinicon can pick up injector flow pretty good. He can post captures that I got that Jim Kokonis used for the ultrasonic testing class. That'd be great, Paul. And if you post those up, then I can cover those again in next week's live stream. So I did want to cover this test, even though the results aren't conclusive on every vehicle, just because I see it come up in the automotive groups and the Facebook posts and the forums so often. So now that many of you guys have done the test, you can kind of tell that on some vehicles it works fine. It's an easy test to do. If the vehicle has an external regulator, pull sensor real quick, hook it up to the vacuum hose, get a sync channel, and if you get a good waveform or a readable waveform, great. If not, you can move on quickly to a different form of testing. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else I was supposed to cover or not. Let me know if I am supposed to cover something, or if I mentioned I was going to cover something earlier on in the video and I didn't, because I have a really poor memory at the moment. Trying to remember too many things at once. So Bart said that he used it as a pulse damper, and I was trying to think if any vehicles used an actual pulse damper that had a vacuum port or a vent line that we could easily attach to, because I know Subaru uses them and they're in the engine bay, but they don't have a vacuum port. They're kind of sealed. And then Nissan, I believe, ran them above the fuel pump inside the tank on some of their vehicles, but they didn't have a vent or a vacuum port either. So if you used a fuel regulator and you just capped off the output line and just ran the fuel pressure into it, then you should be able to use that vacuum port for pretty good readings. If that's it, we'll wrap this one up. And I still have to finish editing the video for tomorrow. I have to go down to the shop in the morning and get a couple more captures because the vehicle I was diagnosing, I disassembled it and confirmed the diagnostic. So I want to get some pictures of what I found when I disassembled the vehicle. And that way you guys can see that some of these tests do have great value and you can rely on them, while other ones like week 14 test, you may not be able to. There are some out there that are, definitive results, or there's ways to completely confirm what we're seeing on the lab scope. Have a good night. Look for the video tomorrow. I'm not sure what time it'll come out, and I will see you guys in a live stream next Saturday. Thanks.